things as we go along. Well, as David said, well, he said it rather, I wasn't going to say it as quite as enthralling, did he say? I don't know. The background to this talk, anyway, is a short outline I presented earlier this year, really about the development of Chippenham's town plan. And after that, as he said, I was asked to broaden its scope to consider other Wiltshire towns in the light of the work that the Victoria County History has been doing over the years. So tonight I'm going to survey our county's towns generally and returning from time to time to Chippenham, which I'm currently working on, and to try and see it in the context of its neighbours. And I want to highlight the invaluable contribution that the VCH has made over the years to our understanding of towns. So a number of the maps and illustrations, including some really splendid aerial photographs that I'll show you, will be derived from the volumes we have published. Now, on the screen is a satellite image of a town, a Wiltshire town, not from the VCH, of course, it's a modern satellite. And I rather hope that you've been trying to work out where it is while I've been talking. Well, it's Wootton Bassett, obviously. And if you were trying to work it out, that's really good because it means I've already got you on my wavelength. But before we develop this shared enthusiasm we've discovered for Wiltshire towns, I must begin with a few words about the progress of the VCH here in Wiltshire and about the discipline of urban history generally. Well, although some research was commissioned in the early years of the 20th century, the VCH, as I'm going to call it from now on, in Wiltshire, really only got going after the Second World War, in 1947, in fact, and it was instigated by Swindon Borough Council. Wiltshire's approach was quite innovative in its day, compared with the pre-war VCH volumes. And the way we've tackled our subject has evolved over time as the discipline of local history itself has developed, and the resources available for studying it have expanded. It may seem strange to think of history changing over time. Of course, what actually happened in the past cannot change, but the tools for finding out about it, and more particularly what we find interesting about it, that's always changing. As our present circumstances change. So history, in a sense, is not just the past, it's really the interaction of the past with the present. And anyway, that's what I think about it anyway. So what I'm going to do this evening is to pick on one particular aspect of local history which has developed enormously, and to see how the VCH has approached it since 1953, when in Wiltshire we began publishing our red books. The topic is, if you want the boring description of it, it's known as urban morphology, but more poetically, I suppose, it's known as the landscape of towns. It's something that's interested me ever since I read this book, the bottom left one there, called The Landscape of Towns, soon after it came out in 1976. Our first topographical volume, the one we published in 1953, I say we, corporately, I was still in my pram in 1953, I think. But the first volume in 1953 that we published included 3 towns, Bradford, Melksham and Trowbridge. And that appeared when the discipline I'm focusing on was, well, really still being formulated by its pioneers. So it's hardly surprising that our editors in those days took relatively little account of it, that it hadn't really developed as a subject. But of the pioneers, 2 of them are well known in local history circles. William Hoskins published his book Devon with its chapter on towns in 1954. And then the seminal Making of the English Landscape, also with a chapter on towns, the following year. Maurice Beresford, bottom right, included 2 chapters on towns in the History on the Ground in 1957. And I think he summed up this new approach very succinctly, and he said, to detect the finger of the past in the present landscape and to show how topography, even of streets and squares, is still the child of history. And after that, he went on to complete and publish his major study of new towns a decade later. That's the one at the bottom in the middle. Well, less familiar than all of these, than these 2 authors, but more focused on work on just on towns alone, was a historical geographer, a man called Michael Conzen. Now, rather like Pewsey, David's been talking about just now, he was a pre-war German emigre who came to Britain and pursued an academic career. And he spent the 1950s analysing town plans and actually measuring components of plots and boundaries in order to try to discover how places came into being, how they grew in compartments, as it were, and how they were modified over time. And his great work was on Alnwick in Northumberland, and that was published in 1960 and is regarded as a pioneer study of the topography of an individual town. Well, his approach, sometimes known as microtopography of town elements, is still followed, and there's an excellent example which wasn't published until 2000, so 40 years later. But this is a study of a Wiltshire town, a small Wiltshire town, and it was devised to enhance the archaeological report on Ludgershall Castle. Now I can point out some of the elements. You can see that the authors of this report, two researchers on the old Royal Commission on Historic Monuments, now part of English Heritage, they took the town to pieces and labelled the different components, as you can see, A, B, C, D. Well, A at the top here is the castle and its precinct. And you would think perhaps, and it sounds from the way they labelled it, as if they thought when they started that next to the castle a small town would develop with a wide main street. That would be the thinking, and then these other bits added later. But when they did their research, they came to the conclusion that actually there was a marketplace here, G, the green part here, and on either side, the first town developed here, on either side of the marketplace, and here, and the church is in this area. Well, the church is just there, so the church kind of overlooked the marketplace, and their conclusion was that the area that they called B had actually been superimposed on an earlier town plan and was a later development, and then there were other developments as well. So this linear section along the main road to Andover came rather later. But it's an example of 40 years after Conzen's pioneer work, how the same techniques were being applied to a Wiltshire town. Of course, the 1960s was a period of massive destruction of town centres by developers and by local councils, it has to be said. And this triggered major archaeological projects in threatened historic centres such as Winchester and York. And then a heritage-inspired backlash, I suppose, to this wanton redevelopment started growing from the 1970s. And a series of county reports was commissioned, including one in Wiltshire from Jeremy Haslam, who's a leading scholar in this field of town plans. And his report, he was based here in Wiltshire Museum, his report was published in 1976, and it tried, by analysing maps and plans, to deduce the historical development of towns, and more particularly their archaeological potential, so that it would be a useful tool if and when planning applications went in for further development. Well, since then, our understanding of towns, not only from archaeological excavations, but also through the editing and publication of medieval and later documents, and now, of course, the easy availability of historic maps, this has increased dramatically. And I think now it would be unthinkable, really, to write the history of a town without considering its topography as a major topic of interest and evidence. Well, while all this was going on, in Wiltshire, the VCH was steadily researching and publishing town histories. Well, I say steadily, but it was a bit unsteadily at first, I think. I told you that our first volume was volume 7. The VCH is wonderful at doing this. So after we published volume 7, we decided we'd publish volume 6, and then we published volume 8. It's even worse in Gloucestershire, where I work most of the time now. We started by publishing volume 2, then we did 7, then we did 11 or something like that. But anyway, we settled down after this in Wiltshire. But the next 2 volumes after the 1953 one were topographical volumes. Volume 6, which included 3 Wiltshire towns: Old Sarum, Salisbury and Wilton, and then 8, which included Warminster and Westbury. And they appeared in 1962 and 1963, respectively. Now, in their coverage of urban topography, they represent a great advance, and they display a huge amount of insight and wisdom, much of which I'm sure can be laid at the door of the young assistant editor between 1959 and 1964. He's not so young now. A certain Kenneth Rogers, well known to many of us subsequently as our long-serving county archivist in Wiltshire. A further 10 volumes have appeared since 1963, and between them they cover most of our towns, and successive editors have continued the interest in their shape and their structure. In particular, Douglas Crowley, whose career with Wiltshire VCH extended from 1968 until 2006. And he's still editing Wiltshire urban history documents in his retirement in Suffolk. And as it turns out, I was discussing them with him face to face in Chippenham earlier this week. So this evening, let's look at Wiltshire towns in some sort of chronological order. That is, not the order in which we've published them in the VCH, but in roughly the order in which the towns themselves came into being. We've not, in fact, finished with towns. I'm currently working on Chippenham, and my colleague Mark Forrest on Mere. We have hopes that before too long work will begin on Highworth, and there will still be a number of smaller places left to consider. Villages now, but once with urban pretensions, and I'm thinking of places such as Castle Combe and Heytesbury, Laycock and Sherston. I should say, however, as we begin our survey, that though it may come as a surprise to many people, very few new towns in Britain came into being after about 1250 AD, and certainly none in Wiltshire. They changed, they grew, they declined, they rebuilt themselves, and sometimes they moved their focus and so on. Of course they did over the centuries since 1250, but to survey all that, you really would be here for hours. I'm interested tonight in looking at their plans to try to understand how and why they came into being, and how they adapted as they came to maturity in the first centuries of their existence. I will say a little bit at the end about major changes since 1250, and Swindon, of course, will figure in that. But I wouldn't want you to imagine that when I get to the year 1250, I'm only halfway through my lecture. I will have nearly finished. You'll be very relieved to know. Well, the first proper towns, and this is the map on the left, were Roman, of course. And of these, the most important in Wiltshire was Cunetio. You can see it here, which is just outside Minor, near Marlborough. We didn't say much about that in our account in 1983, and in fact we didn't say much about Roman towns generally. We were very dismissive about Sorvia Dunum, Old Sarum down here, Roman Old Sarum that is, and the other roadside settlements such as Dura Canovium, which is here as Wamborough, and Volucchio over here, Sandy Lane, just outside near Calne. In fact, in the last that one, we just had a sentence fitted incongruously into a paragraph headed prehistoric remains. I think somebody ought to have edited that bit. In fairness to the editors, most of what we know now about these places comes from archaeological reports published more recently than they were doing their work. And the best summary, I think, is still that by Mark Calne, where I've taken this map from his volume. It's in the volume of papers that was published by our host tonight, the Wiltshire Museum, in tribute to their late curator Ken Annable. Moving forward several centuries, there's a list of that survives of fortified towns in Wessex in about the year 900. It was an organised regime of fortified towns to protect the population of Wessex in the event of attack. So it's spaced all round the kingdom. So it's around 900 AD, it's dated, in the middle of the Saxon period, and it's been much studied and debated. It's called the Burgel Heidich. Now the map on the right shows you 4 places in Wiltshire and one just outside, which are mentioned there, and you can see them there: Malmesbury, Cricklade, Wilton, Shaftesbury just a few hundred yards over the county boundary, and a place, well, it's either Tisbury or Chisbury, which is near Great Bedwyn in the edge of Savernake Forest. In the VCH, we stick to thinking that it was Tisbury down here. Personally, I disagree. It's too close to Shaftesbury, in my opinion. But quite a lot of this research is partly based on hunches and opinions. Well, of the towns on this map, and the map does extend further, of the towns you can see on there in Wiltshire and neighbouring counties, some of them have a very regular plan, and they were probably new or fairly new when the list was drawn up. Typically, it's a main street bisecting a linear main street bisecting a rectangular sort of playing card shaped circuit of defences. And if I show you, the top left there is Wareham in Dorset. The bottom left is Wallingford, which used to be in Berkshire, is now in Oxfordshire. And the one on the right is our map in the VCH of Cricklade. And you can see the defences are marked around the edge of the town here, with the spine street running straight up the middle. Our account of the town, which is fairly recent, published in 2011 and written by Douglas Crowley, gives a full account of the topography of the Saxon town, and it adds significantly to what was previously known. And it also includes an aerial photograph taken from the north. So if you were standing about here, right at the top right-hand corner, looking down the street slightly from the air, you would get this view, and you can see the line of the town going beyond the picture there and then coming right round. This is the town defences, right round like that. The River Thames is bridged just here, so we're looking south, and you can see the wide main street running the whole length of the town, with a chapel on the bridge, on the defences. Moving on to the other towns on that list, Malmesbury and Shaftesbury. I included Shaftesbury for this for 2 reasons. One, it's very close to Wiltshire, and 2, I've studied it quite a lot. They're very similar in topography in a way, because they're both on high spurs surrounded by much lower ground. So they're very easily defendable sites. And although they appear to have rather different plans, in fact, in origin, they're very similar. They both have a planned layout within these constricted hilltop sites alongside major monastic foundations. And I'll just try and point these out. So if we take Malmesbury first, the monastic area is here, the Abbey Church and the various abbey buildings that survive and don't survive in this area. And the town has been ranged along the spur, which starts to fall dramatically at this point, along a central main street with regular burgage plots, as they're known, running back on either side. In here, they later were cleared to make a marketplace, but initially the main street would have been the market. And it runs back to the escarpment edge on either side. Now, Shaftesbury looks rather different, but in fact, we think that the original, well, the monastic area is here, but we think that the original town was actually in this area here. And so and the land falls away at this point. So it is rather similar in a sense, in that you have a regular planned town attached to a monastic site. And it's only later, the end of the Saxon period, that a second, in fact, two sort of market areas form, one here at the top of the famous Gold Hill, and the other at an area called the Commons here, and then streets run away with regular areas of planned settlement on either side. And curiously, both these two towns have a street called Bimport, which means inside the port, Saxon, meaning a Saxon word for a town, so within the Saxon town. The other town on that 900 AD list is Wilton. And that seems to be planned too. Wilton, we're fortunate, we have the earliest town plan to survive of anywhere in Wiltshire, and that is 1568. That's the one I've slanted it slightly to be aligned with the Ordnance Survey map on the bottom left, and with our VCH map as the main map there. The outline, Wilton appears to be, well, it's probably easiest to use the VCH map here because it names the streets. It appears that the early part of Wilton is in this area here, with the church, the main church here, and an area known as Kingsbury Square just there. And a secondary feature is this long West Street running out there, and you can see it on here, a regular street running to a point where there must have been a gate into the town, because the roads go off, and anyone who's driven to Wilton, you know, you come to a sudden discontinuity, a sharp bend just at that point. What Wilton seems to have started as a quite insubstantial village, and the VCH map makes clear that it gradually took over its neighbouring settlements. So you see there's suburbs: Washern, a suburb; Bulbridge, a suburb; Burdens Ball, a suburb; Ditchampton, a suburb. And we know a bit more since the VCH worked on all this about Ditchampton, because an excavation done just here within the town a few years ago by Wessex Archaeology started turning up bodies from a cemetery, and there was a great wall next to it, and it turns out that was the churchyard and part of the church of the original settlement at Ditchampton. We're pretty sure that that's what it was. So Ditchampton got taken over, or part of it got taken over, when the town extended here and put a defensive line across there. It's rather hard to see why Wilton was a good candidate as a defensive stronghold, unless you regard those abundant rivers all around it as a suitable defensive defence from attack. But indeed, there's long been the suspicion that Wilton's best defence in time of attack, which is what happened a century later, was to scarper up the hill into the Iron Age defences of Old Sarum nearby. Well, I mentioned that Wilton has an area near the principal church called Kingsbury Square. You drive through it between as you leave Wilton for Salisbury. And it's widely thought that name denotes the position of the royal enclave, the government premises, if you like, within the royal town, the king's town. Well, by the time of this list of towns in 900, or very soon afterwards, there were other towns coming into being on royal estates, and they were presumably, as royal foundations, they were the local headquarters for a royal estate. And there's two beside Wilton that have this telltale Kingsbury name in Wiltshire. Calne on the left, and you can see here, Kingsbury Green, they call it, but this is Kingsbury Street here, running away from the church. And the other one is Marlborough, with its green, and the original, one believes, Saxon settlement here, around the green and St Mary's Church, with Kingsbury Street running up the hill to the side there. Both of these towns, like Wilton, later expanded by beyond what we may take to be their original rectilinear plans. Again, there's a certain amount of supposition. When Douglas Crowley did Calne back at 2003, was it something like that? He had a different take on this. Jeremy Haslam suggests that this is the Saxon town because it has the Saxon borough, as it were. It has a big church and it has the Kingsbury name and then the green, the open area beyond. And he reckons that this is the Saxon town. Douglas acknowledges that the church is there, but he suggests that the fortified side was over here, just off to the left, where there was a tradition of a later castle and the ground is much higher. I'm afraid I go with Jeremy on this one, I'm afraid. Now, that's two places with these royal enclaves, and I think from my work on Chippenham that the same thing happened there. I'll show you this slide again, this map again in a little while to show you the later development. But my opinion is that we have a regular playing card shape town developing here along what becomes St Mary's Street, which has the church. It actually has a Roman site under there, but near the church, as is quite common. And I think that the Kingsbury, although it's not called as much, was in this area. I can't give you all the facts and figures now, but it is worked out. The evidence can be worked out. And then this would be the spinal main street down a rectangular town, something like that. The street is there on the right, that's St Mary Street as it is now. And we don't have a Kingsbury, we have this name Imbury, which sort of suggests that it's something to do with the fortifications. It's on the edge of the fortifications or something. The Bury part means that. So by the time that the Normans arrived, and as reflected in Domesday Book, all these places I've mentioned so far were recorded as towns, but there were others as well. And they were the centres of large rural estates in most cases, which had started to take on urban characteristics. Right, how many of you know where that one is? Oh, it says at the bottom, that's how, so it's fairly easy. Great Bedwyn in the depths of Savernake Forest is an example of a town, so-called at Domesday Book, which probably we wouldn't regard as a town now. And it has a slightly odd plan because the church, you see, is right down here, whereas the square, the crossing and the little open part is some distance away, suggesting that it developed, and that it developed from an original nucleus perhaps around here and extended along to meet that crossroads. But you wouldn't regard it now as a town, I think. And another one, which I'll show you a slide in a minute, is Tilshead, high up on Salisbury Plain, and that was described as a town in Domesday Book. But there are others, Domesday towns, which certainly existed and flourished thereafter, and perhaps the good examples are Warminster, Amesbury, and Westbury. They certainly grew into towns, and you should see for Bedwyn and now again for Westbury, the VCH published superb aerial photographs. I find this one, particularly of Westbury, immensely pleasing somehow. I don't know quite how to put my finger on it, but you've got the church bang centre in the middle of the photograph. You've got it overlooking its marketplace just here. You've got a sort of network of streets coming around, and the great big Angel Mill much later, of course, in the foreground. But you can kind of make out the nucleus of the original town. Well, we've looked at Chippenham, Marlborough and Wilton to some extent, and they owed some of their success in the Saxon period as later to their position beside a major river crossing. And of course, in this respect, they were joined in the late Saxon period and then into the Norman period by some other Wiltshire towns. Get it working again. There we are. Bradford, for example. Well, Bradford makes it clear in its name, of course, that its position is based on a river crossing, the Broad Ford. And the VCH, in its first published volume in 1953, included this buckler watercolour of Bradford Bridge. as its frontispiece. I don't think we've ever done that again, not colour, not so far anyway, colour as a frontispiece to our books. And another town which also owes part of its part of its success to a river crossing is Melksham. Melksham Bridge there on the left. If you want to know what Chippenham Bridge used to look like before they replaced it in the 60s with a rather unpleasant one, it was an elegant one, rather like Melksham's Bridge. And you can see from this plan on the right how the town related to its bridge. This is one of Jeremy Haslam's plans from his 1976 report. I do think Melksham is a much underrated town in a way. You can see here the bridge is at the top of the river there. I seem to have lost my, can I just get back my spotlight? There we are. No. There we are. And a street running up through the town to a broadening marketplace, a very fine marketplace with the church and fine houses and a fine street running away down there. Well, those are towns that we know existed by Domesday Book, and there were one or two other late Saxon towns with special functions. One of them was the one on the left here, Ramsbury. Ramsbury was the seat of Wiltshire's bishop until it was replaced by Old Sarum by the Normans. And Old Sarum itself is a specialised town, perhaps the citadel for Wilton, which developed itself as a town and of course is being much studied now. Tilshead is perhaps the most surprising place to be described as a town in Domesday Book. Tilshead there on the right. We occasionally get old gaffers in our photographs. I don't know whether they've posed or whether I suppose it is a genuinely old photograph. No one seems to have been able to explain why Tilshead was regarded as a town in Domesday Book, and including the VCH in 1995 when it was published, they couldn't adequately explain it, except to say what other people had said, that it might have been a collection centre for the wool grown on Salisbury Plain, but that's only a guess. Now, the 2 centuries between the establishment of Norman rule and the spread of epidemic disease culminating in the Black Death. So in other words, from around 1100 to 1300, saw a great increase in England's population, including in Wiltshire, particularly in Wiltshire, we think. And this increase had profound effects on Wiltshire's towns. And I think it did that in 3 main ways, not just in Wiltshire, but nationally, but we can identify it in 3 ways in Wiltshire. Extensions and enlargement of the existing towns, that's one category. The promotion of large villages into small towns, usually by their landowners, because they thought they could get more money by farming people rather than crops, as it were. So that's the second category. And the third is the creation of entirely new towns. And I just want to look at all 3 categories and show you some examples. Although I think one should stress that the distinction between these 3 categories is somewhat blurred, and rather more blurred than the pioneers in the 1950s and 60s took account of. Well, I suppose the most spectacular example of a Saxon town that expanded after the Norman conquest is Marlborough, with the creation of its wide high street on the left there, and burgage plots running away on both sides. Now, all 3 of the pictures on the screen at the moment are from our VCH volume published in 1983, volume 12, which covered Marlborough. We looked, you see, at the green, the original Saxon town by looking from St Mary's Church, which on the aerial photograph is this area up here. Nowadays, you'd have to stand in Marlborough High Street for a very long time to get a picture with only one motorbike and the back end of one rather elderly car there. But whenever this was taken, there wasn't nearly so much traffic. So that picture is of the town hall and is taken from about there, looking to the town hall and the and the St Mary's Church. But this magnificent aerial photograph shows you the connection between the burr, which gave Marlborough its name, the prehistoric super barrow, as I think everyone would now agree it was, rather like Silbury Hill, which became the motte of a Norman castle, and the second church that was built at the far end of the Norman High Street, St Peter's. And the terrific width of the High Street, which is seen so well here, but you don't see it so well now with cars parked up the middle and down both sides, shows a spectacular piece of town planning, really. A rather different form of expansion in several stages occurred at Warminster, and it's well documented by the VCH, by Ken Rogers in the 1960s. And the way Warminster developed has left the Minster Church up here, which no doubt was the original nucleus here, and the manor house here. So this bit, one believes, is the original Warminster, and indeed it takes its name from the River Wear, which is running along here. But it expanded in stages until you get right up to here. I mean, the post office, which is now closed, but you can imagine the post office would be regarded as a more recent focus of the centre of the town, is right here. And so if one were to do rather like that Ludgershall component study, you'd have a component here, something like this. There's another one that is here because excavations were done in Emwell Street here, which show a sort of late Saxon industrial area running down to the river just here. And then you have another one, and there's quite a clear block there. And then yet another one here running up to a big wide marketplace along a high street here. So it's a complicated plan, and it's clearly happened in a number of stages. And again, my work in Chippenham, I think, shows the same process of expansion at work during this period. We have a major river crossing here, and then a new main street, a new main high street, running up towards the old fortified town and broadening out into a marketplace adjacent to it, and then running away. So if that's the boundary between the old and the new town, then running away south to the causeway towards Calne. And I think much the same the other way up, as it were, was going on down the road at Calne. We had the Saxon enclave here, in my view, which then comes down to the bridge of the River Marden somewhere here. And then a marketplace develops at that point, and then a street running away to the north just there. So that's two examples of, two or more examples of towns that existed by the Norman conquest, but then developed rapidly in the 11th, 12th and 13th century. But my second category, you see, as society changed and enlarged between 1100 and 1300 and became more used to urban living, even on a small scale, than it would have been before, and especially in Wiltshire and in the south generally, in the period between about 1200 and 1230, 1240, 1250. A remarkable number of Wiltshire settlements tried to make this transition from important village to small towns. In some cases, most cases, in fact, it was an enterprising landowner who tacked a planned extension and a marketplace onto his existing settlement. And there's a really spectacular example that the VCH hasn't covered yet, and this is Sherston. Now, just look at that. Which we look at, the satellite. The church is up there somewhere. You can see it on this one. The church is up there, and near the church, streets come in, roads come in from all parts of the large parish. One coming up from there, one coming up from there, from over here, and so on. And in the 13th century, the landowner created this wide high street, these regular plots running back to a regular back lane like that. And that's always a sign, obviously, of systematic planning. he's turned his village into a town, with a high street, a town hall at one end. Well, it's at this end, isn't it? The Tolsey. And then a back lane running back, and to some extent, not quite so regular on this side as well, running back to, in this case, a pre-existing road coming in. I think that's a wonderful example of a village trying to become a town. And there is another one as well, the one I showed you right at the beginning. This is Wootton Bassett. We have the church here, and the assumption is that the original farm by the wood, Woodton, settlement by the wood, was somewhere here, the wood being Braden Forest. And then the Bassett family, whose name comes into the town, built a wide main street, or widened the main approach from this direction, and built a regular town of burgage plots running back. And what they do at Wootton Bassett is they run back to one boundary here. That's kind of the houses and the back gardens. And then they have sort of areas of farmland behind. They run back to another straight rear boundary running along here. And then the land falls away quite steeply behind that. There are others that we might also consider. I could keep you here all night doing that, and I'm not going to. There are other places in North Wiltshire, such as Highworth, and indeed Swindon, Old Swindon, which show elements of 12th or 13th century, usually, planned development from a village to a small town. Or further south, there's Heytesbury, there's Pewsey, and there's Market Lavington, the hint in the name that Lavington was trying to become a market town. The stimulus for others was the existence of an abbey. We saw that at Malmesbury and Shaftesbury, but it happened elsewhere. It happened at Laycock, for example, where there are actually two marketplaces in Laycock, quite extravagant for a small town. Or here at Amesbury, you can see the thinking is that the original Amesbury Abbey, the Saxon Amesbury Abbey, is in this area. When it was refounded in the 12th century as a joint house, a double house of male and female religious, the major one, the female house, was built here, and this, which became the parish church as well, was the church for the male brethren. Not everyone would agree with me on that, but that is a view. And this map is from our 1995 BCH volume. And I do like the way whoever it was, Douglas probably, chose photos. I think that's great. The little girl is looking across to a bicycle parked on the other side of the road. So that's one thing. A nearby abbey would lead to the creation of a town, or the development of a village into a town. Another would be the existence of a castle. We saw that at Ludgershall. We can see it too at Mere, and we can see it here at Trowbridge, an early Norman castle on the site of what became Home Mills in this area here, and is now the Shire's shopping centre. And the interesting thing about Trowbridge I want you to notice is the way the streets, the castle must have had its motte and its bailey in this area, and so the street plan reflects the semicircular pattern of the castle bailey with two streets like that. It's not often, and this is a view, an old view, again, both published in our 1953 volume, of the open area, the market area, which is just about here, looking to the church, which is behind there. But bear that in mind, of course, when we come to look at my third category, which are the completely new towns. And do you notice some sort of similarity now between Trowbridge and this town, which of course is Devizes? And in Wiltshire, we have two of the classic textbook examples of medieval new towns. Large towns which were created from nothing in the early medieval period and grew and prospered. Now this is Devizes from this wonderful 18th century map. And Devizes was published, I think, in 1975, and the Devizes article was written by a man called Rafe Pugh, And it was Ralph Pugh who in the 1940s, through his energy, started up the dormant Victoria County history nationally by introducing the idea of partnerships between the University of London and local authorities. And Wiltshire was the test bed for this. And he had a particular affinity with Wiltshire, and particularly with Devizes, because his uncle, Clarence Pugh, had been the librarian at the Wiltshire Museum, Devizes Museum as then was, and Ralph Pugh had often spent his summers, I think, staying with his uncle and aunt. And so he grew to a fondness for Devizes. And when it came to who was going to write the article on Devizes, he was by then in charge of the whole VCH. He was the general editor of the whole VCH. But he wrote Devizes as a kind of labour of love, I think, and did it very well. And again, we have this aerial photograph of Devizes looking at it. Well, you all know Devizes, I'm sure, from the Wadworth end here, right up to the marketplace, partly infilled here. And I think if I take it back to Dawes' plan, the accepted view, I think, is that the castle was here. The bailey, the castle precinct, extended out to a line somewhere here at first, which meant that the town developed outside it, rather like a lagging on a tank, as it were, round here, and created its marketplace up here, which is Monday Market Street and Maryport Street up here, with a church overlooking it there. When the Castle Bailey was no longer needed for defensive purposes, its church, St John's, and its large open area was made into a much larger market area here. So Devizes had a second market, and that in turn, as we shall see in a minute, got infilled. Not everybody believes that's the way it worked, but that's the accepted view. And you see it here, and you can still more or less make out the old boundary of the old boundary of the Castle Bailey, with then the second marketplace, or the first marketplace, Monday Market, as it's later called in this area, by St Mary's Church, the new market and St John's Church up here being the second market. The other textbook new town, of course, in Wiltshire is Salisbury. And I'm not going to say much about that. That requires another lecture, really. But you can see from this 18th century plan how the idea of regularity is taken to very great lengths. And the question there is more, what do we make of the irregularities, the slight irregularities? And the theory is that these are denoting pre-existing lines, this one particular, and then down out of there. But we can still see, again, the VCH published a fine aerial photograph, not actually looking from the same direction, it's looking from the east. So your viewpoint on that picture would be somewhere here, and you're looking across to St Thomas's Church, which you can see just there. So we have two classic large towns, large successful towns, which figure in every textbook on town planning. But we also have two small ones, which remain small, and they're worth looking at as well. This one, the satellite picture, shows up the regularity of the plan very well. But the plan on the left, which we published in the VCH in volume 11 in 1980, I think, is actually a plan of a larger area, the parish of East Noyle, out of which Hindon, which this is just a tiny fragment. Do you see there? The parish of Hindon is that bit. And that is fairly typical of some of these completely new planned towns, that they're built on the edge of a large estate. And in this case, the estate of Noyle, which belonged to the Bishop of Winchester, and was almost equidistant from his base at Winchester and his large holdings in Somerset around Taunton. So one reason possibly for creating a new town here was that it was a useful stopover on the frequent journeys that officials and others had to make between Winchester and Taunton. And you can see it has a very regular plan, a main street down here, streets coming in from Knoyle in this direction, Knoyle and Mere coming in from there, a slight kink, and then heading off to Salisbury in this direction, or to Wilton first and then to Salisbury in that direction there. But this is typical of one type of small planted town, of which Maurice Beresford, who I mentioned near the beginning, one of the pioneers, noted 6 of them all created by the Bishop of Winchester within a space of about 20 years. 4 of them not in Wiltshire, mostly in Hampshire, but 2 of them in Wiltshire, Hindon being one, and this is the other one. This is Downton. Now, there's an existing settlement, a Saxon Downton over here with the church, which is just appearing. It's probably behind me. It is on my screen. And the river crossing also down there. But the borough that the Bishop of Winchester created appears to have been in this area here, a regular thing. It's lost quite a lot of its regularity, but that appears to be the rectangular borough, and indeed the street is called the borough down here. And then there's a second one, or perhaps this came first, but there's a second component of the plan which is very regular and remains very regular because it's got watercourse behind it and so on, and that is this bit here. And we do find in some documents that Downton is divided, the town of Downton is divided into 3, the old bit around the church and then 2 other bits, and that seems to be what we have there. Well, after about 1250, and I told you that I was coming to the end when I say after about 1250, after about 1250, there's little evidence of deliberate town creation or major extension in Wiltshire for about 5 centuries. But of course, many changes occurred in the existing towns. As I said at the beginning, the evolution of towns since their foundation really needs another evening. So briefly tonight. Many of them, and we've seen some already, dwindled back to large villages, such as Bedwyn. We mentioned Laycock, I've mentioned Sherston, never took off as a big town, Heytesbury, but others did well and grew. And one symptom or sign of success in a town was a vigorous market and vigorous marketplace. And then the town centre might fill up, and we call this market infill. Permanent shops and structures take the place of where formerly there had been just market stalls. We see it in Salisbury most noticeably because the original marketplace extended from there to there and had the church sort of overlooking it. So like that, going back to the river at the back. And then you see these rows develop quite early on. Most of the names are lost now, but we still have Butcher Row and Fish Row and Oatmeal Row still surviving. The same thing happened at Devizes. You can see that the marketplace is originally twice as big here, and all this bit, including the town hall, has been infilled and remains infilled. It's still a pretty impressive marketplace, you have to admit, but if you go there on a Thursday, it's wonderful, but it's much smaller than it used to be. And I can see the same in Chippenham. You see that the high street comes up to this very similar shaped, well, probably to that point, very similar shaped open market, which we know during the 14th and 15th century, and certainly much later, was filling up with market stalls, and they were becoming permanent shambles and so on, and the shambles are still there. So we see that in the most successful towns. We don't see it very much. I mean, it did happen a little bit in Marlborough, but Marlborough had such a big, wide main street anyway that I think, and such a long street, so there are plenty of shops down the sides. It didn't develop so much in Marlborough. There were a few, and they've gone now. So that's one feature. Another is that we see suburbs developing in most of the successful towns. south in Devizes, Southbroom, the Green area, and St James area of Devizes. In Marlborough, it's the St Margaret's area down towards the river, and the Poulton area going off towards Minor. Salisbury, it's Milford on the hill, and Harnham across the river. And I could have shown you examples of all of those, but the ones I wanted to show you were these two. On the left, you see Malmesbury, which has a very constricted site here on its high spur. But there was another settlement to the west of it called Westport, with its own little marketplace. And so Malmesbury was able to expand into what became, in effect, a suburb, the suburb of Westport, although it had been a completely autonomous and independent place. And back to my preoccupation, as it were, to Chippenham. Here I've turned the map round, but here we have the town bridge. So if you're coming down the high street, and most of you will know Chippenham, the town bridge now is only that bit. This is all built over with shops and things on this part of it, and you come to a point where now you go up New Road, which carries on up there and under the railway viaduct. But until the end of the 18th century, when you got to that point, you had to turn left or right. And there's a little road called Foghamshire, which is this one. And there's Monkton Hill, which is going up this way, goes up a steep hill towards the station at this point. And these developed in the Middle Ages as suburbs across the bridge, suburbs of Chippenham. And you can kind of see a regularity in the plan, even then in the 18th century. Then, of course, a few more bits to say here, yes. It's not really until the Industrial Revolution of the later 18th century that we start to see a really big shift in Wiltshire's urbanisation. And the driver is the cloth industry. So places such as Westbury, Melksham and Trowbridge and Frome, just over into Somerset, came to thrive on a domestic first and then later factory-based cloth industry. And our two early volumes in the West Wiltshire towns, volumes 7 and 8, cover this very well, no doubt, partly because of the enthusiasm of Ken Rogers and his colleagues, some of his colleagues. And we have some good images. Here's Bitton Mill in Westbury on the left from volume 8, again, an aerial view showing very well what the mill looked like. And then examples of workers' cottages in towns and villages, so the domestic industry out in the villages, and then the urban industry in Trowbridge depicted in that. If we have time, I could show similar examples from Chippenham, but I'll leave Chippenham out for this one. Now, industry is one reason for in the case of Wiltshire, growth of towns, but in some counties, especially around seaside places, leisure became the agent for completely new town creation or the promotion of villages to towns. Now, I was brought up in a Devon town called Exmouth, which until the 18th century was two inland villages with a little bit of coast that they shared or joined them, Littleham and Withycombe. And Exmouth only really developed into a town. There was nothing much there until in the 18th century. Now, of course, we didn't have any seaside towns here, but the success of Bath nearby as a spa, the equivalent of a leisure industry, if you like, led to imitations in Wiltshire, notably Melksham Spa. But there was also a half-hearted attempt at Chippenham and in a number of nearby villages, such as Holt, between Melksham and Trowbridge. And then another factor in the prosperity and growth of towns was the increase in road travel and main roads. So thoroughfare towns, several places prospered on the back of the coaching trade and its equivalents, carrying and so on. Salisbury and Marlborough in particular, but also Devizes and Chippenham, and briefly Laycock. The Red Line at Laycock, the only brick building, I think, in what I should call a town for the time being, was built to cater for the coaching trade. It's called the Red Line. I call it the White Elephant because a few years after it was built, the coaches decided a better way to get to Bath was either through Chippenham or through Devizes, and the steep hill down into Laycock was more or less abandoned as a main route. So the Red Line became the White Elephant. Then in the 19th century, still on the transportation theme, of course, the railways transformed one small Wiltshire town, Swindon, with its small medieval layout in this area, into a completely different place, a major conurbation. And we covered Wiltshire in our volume 9 in the late 1960s, early 70s, I can't remember. Again, we included some nice aerial photographs. So the old medieval town is here, fairly regular around a kind of grid of streets, Wood Street here and the High Street here. The old church was off back there, and you can see what locals would call the Locana, the market hall there. So there's a little marketplace just there. But you see what happened. From there, the old town grew down the hill, the new town down here with the railway works grew up the hill, and they met at Regent Circus just here, and built their town hall. And we have that aerial photograph. We have another one of the railway works just there. And to make sense of it, you really need a plan. This is Swindon in all its late 19th century glory, with the old town down here in this area. The canal, which is the main definer of the town plan, running along here, because it was the crossing points of the canal from the old town to the railway village and the new town down here, which dictated the pattern of streets. And we have this wonderful discontinuity, which is still there if you walk around the streets of Swindon along here. This bit was developed later as a separate component. So you can still do your medieval town planning, looking at 19th century towns as well. And what I has come to realise, but point out to people, if you think of the town here and the railway works there and the railway lines going through, if you then look at Chippenham, the town is down here. But at the time when the railway came through, Chippenham was a bigger town than Swindon, until the railway works was built there. And Chippenham also developed its railway works here, up here, and all this industrial area on this side of the railway. And it's only just the way history goes, I suppose, that Chippenham, a major town, but not, you wouldn't regard it now. It isn't now a railway town, although until recently, of course, Westinghouse was a major employer, and they were involved with aspects of railway signalling and similar. And before that, Brotherhoods actually made railway locomotives in Chippenham. Well, I've come round to Chippenham at the end, and so I'll leave it with somewhere else. And so, well, looking back on what I've been telling you, I see that I've not really done justice to any of the towns I've mentioned, and there's some that I've not mentioned at all, or only very briefly. Corsham, for instance, or Market Lavington, or Pewsey, or Tisbury. Are they towns now? Have they ever been towns? Corsham has a town hall. What about Tidworth? When I was working on what used to be Kennet District and places there, I think Tidworth was the largest, in brackets, in inverted commas, town in Kennet District. It was larger than Marlborough or Devizes in terms of population. And it has a shopping street, a Victorian, well, late 19th century shopping street, early 20th century shopping street, several large supermarkets now, of course, and a fascinating history going back to its design as a hunting estate. But you see, detailed analysis this evening was not really my aim. I just want people to realise that there is this way of, as Beres would say, detecting the finger of the past, of looking at the places where you and I live, where you and I visit, for enjoyment, looking at them to enjoy them, but also because if people appreciate them, maybe they will look after them rather better. Well, that's all I've got to say, except one thing. You see, at the beginning, I was trying to encourage you to work out what town I was looking at. Have you worked this one out? I'll give you some clues. There's the castle. All right. Here's the old main road. There's the new road, the bypass, just up there. Give you a few more clues. There's the clock tower, the church, which has a sort of close round it, just here. There's the house where the poet William Barnes wrote Lyndon Lee. And if you still haven't got it, you'll probably get it if I tell you that that's the famous wine merchant. It's called Yaps. Well, it's Mere, of course, which, even as we speak, I'm sure my colleague Mark Forrest is painstakingly researching for our next volume, volume 19. Well, I've had my hour and just a little bit. Thank you very much for listening for so long. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop the share now, so we go back to me and David and David. And I'm in their hands now. Thank you very much for listening for so long. Do I have to do something at this point, David? Or
Yes. Over to you, David. You're on mute just at the moment.
I thought that you were going to take us through some questions now.
Yeah, yes. Okay, well, thanks very much, John, for that. I hope you've given people, well, I know you've given people lots of things to think about. Remind people that now's the time you can start asking questions by typing, hitting the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, typing in your question. But I get the luxury perhaps of going first, which is you talked about Devizes, and there's another theory about Devizes that that there were two marketplaces constructed at the same time, with St John's and the area that's now the current town hall as one marketplace, and St Mary's as a second, and then the current marketplace added later in, I think, the 14th, 15th century. That's suggested in VCH. You don't like that idea? Why not?
I rather like the idea of the division between the Castle Bailey and the line of New Park Street and Sheep Street. Partly because of the Brittocks, which of course is the street between them, which runs between the two marketplaces. And in old maps, and certainly even now, there is a little blip at the point where the boundary line between the two goes. I have heard this other theory, and I'm not really persuaded by it. But I think Jeremy Haslam now I think accepts that, doesn't he?
I'm not sure.
No, I'm not sure.
Tim Tatton Brown that
Tim
I remember
Tatton Brown,
talking
yes,
about it.
I had a friendly argument with him in St Mary's Church.
As one does.
After a record society meeting, but he always gets the better of friendly arguments, I find, because he's so forthright. Certainly Tim Tatton Brown. I'm not sure that. I certainly didn't buy his ideas, I'm afraid. No.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? Don't seem to have any at the moment.
Oh dear.
I think just such a huge amount to take in.
That's embarrassing.
I was rather intrigued as well by the infilling in marketplaces, and somewhere you sort of at Chippenham. I found it really interesting. The Eld Hall, which clearly is one of the oldest buildings in the town, is part of that market infilling.
Yes.
Why that should be?
Well, the Eld Hall was the guild hall in effect. It was the town hall, so it was like the market house controlling the market, I think. But many towns you can go to, and the clue to something being market infill, of course, is that you can walk off into it from the street on one side, but then you can walk out the other side and you're back in the street again. So its footprint, as you would say, is just the building itself. It doesn't have any curtilage around it. It doesn't have a yard. It doesn't have any other land apart from what it's built on. And most successful towns have a bit in the middle where that happens. And I mean, it's very obvious in Salisbury, of course, that the pubs along Butcher Row on one side front onto the marketplace on the other side. You can walk straight through.
And
Reeves, for example, you can walk straight to from one side to the other.
And doing very well at the moment because of it.
Very, very good. Yes, well, I mean, but you can see how it emerges, can't you? Because you set up your stall on market day, then you decide, well, we can't be bothered to take it down twice a week. We'll just leave it there, see what happens, and then you think, well, I could actually make it a bit more permanent. It could live upstairs, That's how it works.
You see how that evolves. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Ian has asked, you mentioned back lane, which we have examples of in Marlborough and Ramsbury. Are back lanes always related to landowner and estate developments?
Well, I think, we have one in Sherston as well, and I mean, they're not always called back lane, but the idea of town planning in this sense, and town plantation, artificial town plantation, as it were, is that you create what are known as burgage tenements, burgage plots, for which you charge a set rent, and they start off all being the same size, and of course they will then all have a rear boundary, and it's just common sense really to have an access along the back. So this is how the back lane usually gets created, and if there's no pre-existing reason for it not to be straight, it will be straight. They're not always called back lane, are they? But it's a symptom of a piece of deliberate town planning, and we saw it all in many of the slides I showed you, I think.
And another question from me. They're starting to roll in, so don't get excited. But
they're just a bit timid.
Back lane. I noticed at Tilshead. I hadn't spotted there's a back lane at Tilshead.
There is, yes.
Is that significant there,
well,
or is that more recent?
No, that's well, we don't have a very early map of Tilshead, I think, but I didn't show you a plan of Tilshead, but it does. It has one of the characteristics that you think of somebody's messed this place around and tried to make a town of it. Because if you drive through Tilshead, you encounter some very sharp bends, don't you? Coming from Devizes, you come down a hill and then you do a right-angled turn by the petrol station, but then you do two more turns to get through it.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right, and that's. And actually, if you put the to scale, if you put the plan of Tilshead against the plan of some of these other towns I've shown you, it is of a similar size. And as you say, it does have a back lane all round the north side of it. I think it does on the south side as well. Not sure about that, but of course, and it's got a wide middle, hasn't it, by the church and the school there. There's a big open area. If you know that it has been described as a town at one point, you can believe it. What you can't believe is why they put a town in the middle of Salisbury Plain. That's my thought. And I think it.
Other than, is it 6 miles from any town or whatever that was supposed to be?
Yeah. But of course, in Doomsday, I think it says it's got 8 mills or 9 mills or something. Where's are they water mills? Where's the water? There's no water in Tilshead, no flowing water. So either it's got interests on the in the Wiley Valley or somewhere else, or they're horse mills, or they're not water mills. It's an enigma. And I can remember, because I wasn't working with VCH, and I reviewed the volume it's in, and I pointed out that just like everyone else, the VCH hadn't worked out why Tilshead was ever a town.
Okay, and question, would you consider Pewsey to be a large village or a small town? I suppose you can extrapolate out to what's the difference? Well,
the whole business of how do you define a town is something that geographers particularly have pondered. And I mean, there used to be a definition that a town is a place with the Woolworths. Well, that's a good one. Or a town is a place where the people think it's a town. People who live there call it a town. Now, when I first came to Amesbury in the 70s, and with the local person wrote a little book about Amesbury, if you look at that book, I wrote half of it, and I wrote a small part of it, and he wrote a bigger part. And throughout, I call it a town, and throughout, he calls it a village. Coming out to Pewsey, I do think of Pewsey as a town, or rather, I did a book about the Vale of Pewsey, and and I said, well, really, there are two places which stand apart in the Vale of Pewsey from everywhere else as being more important and have urban pretensions, shall we say. Market Lavington is one. Market Lavington does have a marketplace and a planned element. Pewsey does have an open area by the Alfred statue, and it has elements of planning, and it has a railway station, of course, as well. Yeah, I think it's on the cusp between a town and a village, isn't it? Yeah.
From Claire, what do you go on to spot the difference between a town which grows in as a series of components and one that enlarges and takes over a suburb? Is it just from the naming of the areas?
That's a very good question. Yes, because the whole business of suburbs, I think, is interesting, and I think, well, I pointed it out at Wilton, because I think there the name suggests that Wilton starts life as just a small settlement, a farmstead. It's not a town that's expanding, already a town that's expanding and gradually taking over other settlements. But I'm not answering this very well, but in Wilton, I gave that example of Ditchhampton, which I thought that the town had actually expanded over it. I suppose you could see the same, well, you can see the way it happens in Salisbury with Harnham, which people who live in Harnham would say they live in Salisbury, but of course Harnham was completely different, and even more so Fisherton in Salisbury, because the city boundary comes at the Fisherton Bridge, so Fisherton was a separate jurisdiction. I'm not quite sure what was the question again?
I think you've answered it, and I've just got to go back to it. Yeah, basically, how do you spot the difference between a town that grows as components, or components get added, and where it actually takes over an existing settlement? Yeah,
well, I suppose it's not clear cut, but the Salisbury is a good example, because Fisherton, which you think of as part of Salisbury, as a suburb of Salisbury, or even part of the city centre now, starts life down by the station, with the old church is down by the station, and it appears to grow towards Salisbury once the city develops. So it creates its own suburb towards Salisbury, just as Salisbury is going out to that.
And was it a separate parish?
Yeah, yes,
so a separate parish, which I suppose is fairly...
Yes, and I mean, you can do the same in Devizes. Of course, South Broome was part of Bishop's Canning's parish. So the edge of medieval Devizes is Sidmouth Street, isn't it? It is, yes. by Sainsbury's and the bookshop there, and everything beyond that is Bishop's Canning's hamlets within Bishop's Canning's parish. Hence the Crammer and the Bishop, you know, the Canning's folk and the Crammer, you see.
Okay. Someone said great lecture, which there's couple of people said that on the chat. Was Marlborough in 1100 more dependent on its livestock market than other Wiltshire towns?
Don't know. No idea. Let's think about it. There's an early reference, isn't there? There's an early reference to fulling, isn't there? To cloth making at Marlborough, Elcott Mill, is it, just outside Marlborough? I honestly don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid. I mean, obviously in general, it's North Wiltshire, the cheese rather than the chalk, which is the dairying and livestock end, and it's the chalk, of which Marlborough, I would have thought, was a constituent, is more the sheep rearing.
Yes, I suppose the question in terms of town planning is how large the marketplace is, and whether then sort of enough room has been left for large number of cattle as opposed to a few sheep.
Yes, I can see that. Yes, because yes, I mean in Salisbury, the cattle market in the Middle Ages was not even in the marketplace. It was at Barnard's Cross on the eastern checkers. The market was so important. The market was so busy that you know, it had different bits of different parts of it for different products. But the cattle, there was no room for the cattle market in the Middle Ages there. That was on the edge of town. Yes, you're quite right.
Yeah. Okay. The the products, I think, may be the answer to the next question, which is, why do so many towns and villages have a silver street?
Ah, good. Yes, that's great. I once did I wanted to know the answer to this question, or rather the question, why are so many silver streets in Wiltshire? Why does nearly every town in Wiltshire seem to have a silver street? And what I did was went online, and I think it was one of the websites where you can look up addresses. I just put in Silver Street and got about 120 places where there were silver streets in England or in the UK, and then sort of plotted them. And it's very much a West Country thing. It's not just Wiltshire. There are quite a lot in Devon and Somerset as well, and Dorset, I think. I can't remember exactly. But it's very characteristic of Wiltshire. And there are fanciful suggestions that it's the Latin word silva, meaning wood. It's sylvan, but I think it's usually thought to refer to the financial district, shall we say, the money side of the town. That's how it's usually.
So it's more like Bank Street than silversmithing.
Yeah, I think so. Of course, there is, the main street in Melksham is called Bank Street, but many towns in Wiltshire have a silver street. Not only towns, sometimes villages have silver streets as well. Although when you get an important sounding street name in a village, it's often just a local joke, really. Lots of flippant street names.
I always think of the city heading on the road from Earlstoke over to Westbury.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Claire's asked, what's the difference between burgage plots and tithings? Can you tell them apart on old maps?
Tithing. Well, a tithing is a division of a parish, and so is a parish a large parish such as Westbury or Urchfont, for example, will have 3 or 4 tithings, and they are separate settlements. The origin goes back to the Saxon period. So in origin, the name means a tithing is a grouping of 10 households. That's where the tithe bit comes from. And 10 tithings make 100, and 100 was the larger division, administrative division. A burgage is just a plot in a town, usually of a regular shape and size, and usually measured in perches, which is 5.5 yards. So there's a set size for burgages in Chippenham and in Salisbury, but they're quite small. They're just like an extended house and garden. A tithing, if that's what you mean, not a tithe. Or did you mean tining? Tithing.
I don't know. It's the
I'll answer both. Tithing is a large area.
Tithing, but she may have meant tining.
Well, you often get a field name or a small area called a tining, Tyning, and that is another word for a paddock. Really, it's a fenced enclosure. A tining. Again, it's a common Wiltshire minor name.
Marion has asked, in Purton, the church is away from the high street with the pubs. Why is that? And you didn't mention Purton.
I don't think anyone would say Purton was a town, would they? I was looking at towns. I have researched Purton, yeah. I'm just trying to think where the church is. Yes, Purton is a very complicated plan for a village. I mean, it's got lots of components, hasn't it? Oh, yes, so the church is some distance from the rest of the village, isn't it? That's usually a sign that usually a church is the barometer of a settlement. I mean, it's where it begins. It's the place moves out from there, moves to some other reason. In the case of Purton, I suppose it's something to do with it's quite an ancient routeway, isn't it, between Wootton Bassett and Cricklade, the sort of ridgeway along there. And I suspect a lot of places try to develop along a main road. It's the opposite of what they do now. They try to attract traffic and therefore trade. But I can't really remember with Purton exactly how it's configured. But I know there's lots of sort of bends, and the marketplace, yes, is quite a long way, isn't it, from the church? Yeah.
Okay. And someone's asked, what's the meaning of Wick being added to the name of a village?
Right. There are two schools of thought here that I know of. The conventional explanation is that it's a secondary settlement, often a dairy farm, away from the main nucleus of the parish, and I'm Potter and Wick. And there are two at Pewsey, aren't there? I mean, there's lots of others. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but Potter and Wick's a good example. That was always the accepted explanation, and in place name volumes, Wick is usually described as a dairy farm. More recently, people have said, well, actually, Wick is a corruption of the Latin word vicus, which is and used in medieval Latin as well, as the name for a village. And there is studies were done of the correspondence between Wick and particularly Wickham names, of which there's one at Urchfont, and Roman remains. So there's an archaeological interest there. And following on from that, it's been suggested that actually the Wick, the vicus, is the earlier settlement, and later the villagers moved away and just left the Wick somewhere else. I don't really think I'd take that. I think it's probably usually just a dairy farm on the edge.
Couple of follow-ups. Where are we? Rosie has said that there's a back lane in Calne as well,
Right.
which is useful. Yeah. Someone has said that Tilshead always used to flood, and of course there's the flood marker on the cottage.
Yes.
Were there springs? You know,
I think Tilshead's relation with water is rather dramatic, isn't it? I mean, it's the head of the River Till, and you would think that's what it means, but it doesn't mean that, of course. What it means, its old name is Theodulf's Hide, so it's named after a person, Theodulf, and that corrupted to Tilshead, and then there wasn't a name for that river, believe it or not, and all the places down there were called Winterbourne, and it was just known as the Winterbourne. And I think this is something that the VCH, when they did those parishes, did discover, was that I can't remember the date, but the date it was first called the River Till was something like 1900 or 1850. It's not an old name.
Probably by more or less by the Ordnance Survey to tidy up the map.
Yes, something like that. And it's what place name people call a back formation. In other words, because the village at the top is called Tilshead, therefore somebody said, oh, well, it must be the River Till. I think Ogbourne near Marlborough has the same, there's a River Og, which connects Ogbourne with the Kennet. And I think that also is a back formation, a misunderstanding of why Ogbourne is called Ogbourne. I don't think it's got anything to do with the River Og, as it were. But yes, you're right, it floods, the Great Flood of 1841, or whatever it was. And I expect you, like me, you have actually encountered floods on that bit just below, on the Shrewton side of Tilshead. Yeah.
Claire said she was asking about the tithing. She said there were some tithings between Tisbury and Hindon, which seem to have been lost as names on modern maps.
Tisbury and Hindon, yeah. Yes. Well, we strayed off towns a little. Well, that's where we have Tisbury and Hindon. I suppose you could say a town. In between is Fonthill Gifford, isn't it? And there is a tithing called Stop. Well, there's a settlement called Stop, S-T-O-P-P, which has a sharp bend in it, and that is on the road between Hindon and, yeah, I'm not quite sure where this is going, but the parish is Fonthill Gifford there. And
someone's asked, where was the spa in Chippenham?
Ah, good. It was. I do know that. It was in St Mary's Street. Actually, we could. I think. Julian, Personal Julian, we had a little conversation about this, or a correspondence about this, because the date usually given to it, I discovered was wrong. It's in a garden in St Mary's Street. Well, that's where it was created and where the relic is. One of those nice houses in St Mary's Street behind the church in Chippenham has the slight remains, and Julian would know more than I do, of a failed spa building. Whereas, of course, the one in Melksham is everyone can see. There's lots of the big houses set back in Melksham.
Certainly very impressive. Yeah. Okay, and I think what will be the last question, because it's just after 9 o'clock, you've been certainly being grilled effectively, from Ian, which is, if there's time, we're making time, could you explain the derivation of the word or the description Kingsbury?
Well, the Kings is fairly obvious. Bury has something to do with fortification. It could just be defended, just with a fence around it, just with a, but it has the idea of a defendable enclosure. And the notion behind the Kingsbury names in Wiltshire is that these are all found in towns or settlements that belong to the king. They don't belong to a bishop or a layman. The idea is that government administration, shall we say, is carried out from a part of these settlements. And so the government or the royal enclosure premises, which is obviously going to be defendable, is therefore known as the Kingsbury. I suppose there might be other terms that could be used for the same thing, but that I think is where it comes from.
Are they generally late Saxon?
Yes, I mean the idea is that the three in Wiltshire, Wilton, Calne, and Marlborough, all seem to occur in towns which would have been in existence in the 10th century. And of course, we know in Chippenham, it's not called Kingsbury, but I think that's what it is. We do have a reference to the king staying there in 887 something, don't we? And then another one in the 950s, I think, and so on.
Okay, well, thank you very much. David, over to you.
So over to me, I think, just to on behalf of all of the audience we can't see, but has been pretty impressive in its size from the numbers recorded on the computer. Thank you, John, for sharing such erudition with us for throughout the evening. We not only have you taught us a lot, you have laid the seeds for any number of further talks we could invite you to give to us over the coming months and years. So be warned, you've put these ideas in our minds. But for the moment, I think it just falls to me to thank you all very much on behalf of us all. It's at this stage that I've invited everybody to applaud rapturously, where we can all do that in our own rooms. You'll just have to believe we're doing it, John. But thank you very much from all of us for a most enjoyable evening.
Well, thank you for listening so long.
And bye-bye to everybody. Thank you for being with us. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.